Claire Whitfield had spent most of her adult life believing that loyalty mattered. For 12 years, every single Sunday, she drove 40 minutes across town to visit her mother Eleanor. It did not matter if she was exhausted from work, sick herself, or struggling financially. She still went. She sat beside her mother during hospital appointments, stayed overnight after surgeries, cooked meals when Eleanor could barely stand, and held her hand through the terrifying weeks of a cancer scare that almost destroyed her emotionally. When Claire's father Robert died in 2019, it was Claire who handled the funeral arrangements, the paperwork, the endless phone calls, and the lonely nights afterward when Eleanor could not sleep in an empty house. Daniel and Patricia appeared when it was convenient for them. Birthdays, Christmas dinners, occasional weekend visits, but Claire was the constant presence. Quiet. Reliable. Invisible in the way dependable people often become. That was why the phone call from St. Mary's Hospital felt unreal. At 5:47 on a rainy Wednesday morning, a nurse informed Claire that Eleanor had suffered a severe stroke during the night. Claire barely changed clothes before running out the door. Her mind raced the entire drive. She kept thinking about the last conversation she had with her mother only 2 days earlier, when Eleanor laughed softly while complaining about the neighbor's barking dog. Nothing about that conversation sounded like goodbye. But when Claire finally arrived at the hospital, something immediately felt wrong. Daniel and Patricia were already there, standing outside Eleanor's room, as if they had been waiting for hours. Daniel lived 3 hours away in London. Patricia lived even farther. Yet somehow both of them had arrived before Claire. For a moment, Claire's instincts told her something was off, but grief drowned the thought before it could fully form. She pushed the suspicion aside and focused only on her mother, lying motionless in the hospital bed. Eleanor died 4 days later on a quiet Sunday morning. The funeral was small and dignified, exactly the kind Eleanor would have wanted. Claire spent most of the ceremony in a blur, barely hearing the condolences from relatives and family friends. Daniel gave a polished speech about family unity. Patricia cried at the right moments. Everything looked normal from the outside. But 2 weeks later, inside the office of Solicitor Graham Aldred, Claire's entire understanding of her family shattered. She sat across from her brother and sister expecting the estate to be divided equally, just as her father's original will had arranged years earlier. Instead, Graham slowly opened a newer document and calmly explained that Eleanor had updated her will 14 weeks before her death. The family home, a beautiful 4-bedroom Victorian house worth nearly £500,000, had been left entirely to Daniel and Patricia. Claire received only a small savings account, a few pieces of jewelry, and a handwritten note from her mother. The silence in the room became unbearable. Claire stared at the papers in front of her as if they belonged to someone else's life. Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the table. Patricia examined her fingernails with unsettling calmness. Neither of them looked shocked. Neither of them even attempted to comfort her. That detail hurt more than the will itself. Deep down, Claire already knew what that meant. They had known this was coming. They had probably known for months. Later that evening, alone in her kitchen, Claire unfolded Eleanor's note with shaking hands. The words inside felt like knives. Eleanor wrote that she had recently been told Claire no longer truly cared about her, that Claire visited only out of guilt and obligation, that she secretly resented the burden of taking care of an aging parent. Daniel and Patricia had apparently warned Eleanor that Claire often complained behind her back. None of it was true. Not one sentence. Claire read the letter 3 times before setting it down in complete silence. In that moment, she understood exactly what had happened. Someone had poisoned her mother's mind slowly, carefully, and deliberately. Over the following days, Claire replayed the last 18 months in her head. Suddenly, everything looked different. Daniel had started visiting Eleanor more frequently around that time. First monthly, then every other week, eventually almost every weekend. Patricia also became unusually attentive, bringing gifts, arranging lunches, offering emotional support she had never shown before. At the time, Claire believed they had simply grown closer to their mother after Robert's death. Now she realized those visits had another purpose entirely. They were not rebuilding family bonds. They were building influence. They fed Eleanor small comments disguised as concern. "Claire sounds stressed lately. I think she feels overwhelmed. Maybe she needs more space from family responsibilities." None of the statements were dramatic enough to sound malicious, but repeated over months to an elderly woman already struggling emotionally, they slowly changed Eleanor's perception of reality. It was manipulation disguised as care, one of the cruelest forms of betrayal because it leaves almost no visible evidence behind. But Daniel and Patricia made one critical mistake. They underestimated Claire. Unlike them, Claire had spent years documenting details while caring for both parents. She kept notebooks filled with dates, appointments, conversations, medications, and observations. What began as an organizational habit during her father's illness eventually became a detailed timeline of family interactions. When Claire met solicitor Helen Marsh, a specialist in inheritance disputes and elder financial abuse, Helen immediately recognized the importance of those records. The investigation that followed uncovered disturbing information. Medical reports confirmed Eleanor had been assessed for mild cognitive impairment shortly before the will was changed. Neighbors described Eleanor becoming anxious and emotionally confused during her final months. One neighbor even recalled Eleanor quietly admitting she feared Claire no longer loved her. Hearing that nearly destroyed Claire emotionally. Her mother had died believing lies planted by her own children. The turning point came when Claire discovered an old voicemail buried deep in her phone. In the recording, Eleanor sounded uncertain and upset. She explained that Daniel had told her Claire wished she had a different family and regretted sacrificing so much of her life for them. Eleanor said softly, "I don't believe that's you, love, but I need to hear your voice." Claire remembered returning the call immediately at the time, reassuring her mother it was nonsense. Back then, she thought it was only a misunderstanding. Now the recording became devastating evidence of manipulation. Soon afterward, Helen Marsh filed a formal legal challenge against the will. During disclosure, another shocking discovery emerged. Daniel possessed an earlier handwritten letter from Eleanor clearly stating she wanted her estate divided equally among all 3 children. He had known her real intentions the entire time. Yet instead of honoring them, he arranged for a new will to be drafted anyway. Then came the final revelation. The financial advisor who helped Eleanor review her estate plans was Margaret Holt, Patricia's mother-in-law. Margaret knew Eleanor originally intended equal distribution. She knew Daniel and Patricia were benefiting from the sudden changes. And she remained silent. The scheme had never been impulsive. It had been coordinated carefully between multiple people who believed Claire was too quiet, too emotional, and too trusting to fight back. They mistook her silence for weakness. That miscalculation destroyed them. For weeks before trial, Daniel's legal team requested mediation. Without officially admitting wrongdoing, Daniel and Patricia agreed to void the contested will and restore Eleanor's original wishes. The estate was divided equally. Afterward, the family collapsed completely. Daniel quietly sold his London apartment within months. Patricia stopped speaking to mutual friends. Margaret Holt retired from financial advising under a cloud of suspicion, though no official charges were filed against her. Claire kept her portion of the house and rented it out instead of selling it. Every month, she donated part of the income to charities helping elderly victims of financial manipulation and abuse. Nearly a year later, Claire drove past the old house unexpectedly and pulled over at the curb. She stood there silently, staring at the upstairs window where her mother's bedroom light used to glow every evening. The house felt empty now, cold, but it was still standing. And despite everything her own family had done to destroy her, Claire was still standing too.